Okay. So when I read White Man's Burden, right, the first thing I always do whenever I read a poem is to just like look at the words that stand out. And the first word that stood out to me was child. Um, and then when I started to look at the rest of the poem, there's a lot of stuff in here about children and parents and the kind of things that like you're supposed to do even though you don't want to do it, but in order to be a good parent you have to do it. And then I started looking at other things like the go bind your sons to exile, and I thought, oh, a parent in the Bible who bound his son was Abraham, and he did it because God told him to do it, and he was going to kill his son just because God told him to do it. And all this stuff about like responsibility and being a good parent, and I started to see this connection between the father and God and country, which makes me think about imperialism as God's work. So I would need to go and like do a little bit more reading on some of these Bible stories that I start to see hinted at here, but try to find a relationship between what we're talking about in the poem versus what we're talking about in the Bible and imperialism, combining those things.
That's really interesting, Nikki.
Thank you.
Hi, students. When I'm reading through this poem, I'm thinking a little bit about context and sort of like what she was saying. There's lines 13 and 14. Take up the white man's burden, no tawdry rule of kings, but toil of serf and sweeper, the tale of common things. Kipling, to me, seems like he's trying to contextualize the imperial goal as being this humble thing, but yet has this potentially great impact, right? So what that says to me is not only it's like a sort of a sincere thing in some ways, but it's also something that he's trying to elevate something that is a little bit humble. So it's a really interesting perspective to try and contextualize this poem through its language.
Hello, students. I think I'm going to pick up sort of on what Nikki mentioned, actually. In the second line, it says to serve your captives' needs. Sorry, your captives' need. And that reminds me a lot of a George Orwell essay. And actually, a German philosopher whose name I forget, your history teacher will remind you. But it's this idea that in enslaving someone, we become enslaved ourselves, right? And I think that is, sounds persuasive. But just that simple idea that in enslaving somebody, we then ourselves become enslaved. So that to me is something that's going to motivate the rest of my reading. And with that in mind, obviously I noticed too, further on, there's this line, why brought he us from bondage, our loved Egyptian knight? And obviously I think that's also linking back to this idea of slavery that's mentioned right at the start and that Nikki's spoken to already.
Bye, students.